Welcome back to the Dershow. I've been watching the hearings today about the Secret Service, and everybody seems to acknowledge that this was just one of the worst blunders in American history. We've had horrible blunders in the past. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated after they tried to shoot him once before. They actually shot a bullet through his stovepipe hat. And the guy who was supposed to guard him, one person was supposed to guard him. He was the commander in chief of an army that was at war, obviously, with Confederates. The one guard that was supposed to guard him, there was no Secret Service at the time, went to a saloon during the intermission and didn't come back. And so John Wilkes Booth just was able to walk into the president's box and put a bullet through his head. It was horrible. Garfield, McKinley, the Kennedy, both Kennedys. Secret Service has been an absolute. The people are great people, the people who put themselves in harm's way, but the service itself hasn't worked. And what I came away from at today's hearings was there were some FBI people as well. All the protective services have to be merged into one protective service. There has to become the United States Protective Service, which incorporates the FBI, the Diplomatic Protection Corps, the State Department, the Federal Marshal's Office, and the Secret Service. They all have the same job, to protect protectees. They have different protectees, obviously, but they have to be able to share intelligence, and they have to be able to coordinate with local authorities. And the FBI seems to do a better job than the Secret Service, but we have to merge them all together. There's no reason for the Secret Service to be dealing with counterfeiting money. It's supposed to be protecting presidential candidates, etc. And so I'm hoping that the result of this hearing will be a fundamental change in the way in which people are protected by the United States government, a merger of all the agencies, much like intelligence agencies today are separate agencies. Sure, the CIA is different from the FBI, but they work in coordination. They work together. That has to happen much more with the Secret Service and with the protection of presidents and presidential candidates. Just imagine how different the world would have been if this assassin had aimed an inch closer to the president's head. So let's hope we'll never see another presidential assassination again, but we have to assume we will. We are a divided country. We have professors teaching on the hard left today in universities, professors who are saying assassination is appropriate, that the ends justify the means, and that there should be no limitations on how we go about bringing about the great, revolution, which will make all people happy. As Brandeis once said, the greatest dangers to liberty lurk with individuals who think they're doing good and who do it zealously, but without understanding. And I think we have a lot of that going on today, particularly on American college campuses on the left. And those are the people who are training our future leaders, and those are the people who are probably training our future killers. And so we have to redouble our efforts to protect protectees of all kind that deserve protection by the United States government. All right, let's turn to the subject at hand. We spoke yesterday about the Biden proposals for changing the Supreme Court. The three proposals, essentially, term limits, ethics codes, and abolishing presidential immunity. And you heard my views on those issues. But I noticed something today that I had missed, and I think every commentator has missed. There is a sentence in the op-ed that President Biden signed. Obviously, he didn't write it. And the question is, who wrote this sentence and what this sentence means? There's one sentence in the op-ed in the Washington Post which suggests to me that the writer was trying to plant the seeds for court packing. Here's what the op-ed says. And again, I wish I had noticed it yesterday before the show, but I didn't, and it deserves a separate show. Quote, I support a system in which the president, and this is the key, in which the president would appoint a justice every 2 years to spend 18 years in active service on the Supreme Court. Everybody has focused on the 18 years. That's the term limitations. I want to focus on every president would appoint a justice every 2 years. Now, if you read that literally, it means without regard to how many justices there are. If 2 years pass and there hasn't been a justice appointed, whoever the incumbent president is, gets to appoint a justice. Let's assume nobody has reached the term limits. So instead of 9 justices, there are 10. And then 2 years later, there are 11. Is this a backdoor way of getting term limits? Well, we know that President Biden himself has expressly opposed term limits, but he appointed a commission. And on the commission, there were many people who favor court packing, who favor adding justices in order to achieve what President Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to achieve in the 1930s when the Supreme Court was rejecting his New Deal. He called for court packing. Justice Felix Frankfurter, who was then a professor at Harvard, called for court packing, and others as well. It was rejected, but maybe it served its purpose. It got the Supreme Court to switch. The switch in time that saved 9 was the motto that was used by people who claimed that the very idea of proposing court packing, remember those days, of course, the Democrats controlled the presidency, the House, and the Senate. They just didn't control the Supreme Court until after the late 1930s, early 1940s, when Roosevelt got to appoint all the justices of the Supreme Court, essentially. So the question is, whoever wrote Biden's op-ed, and it clearly was not Biden, particularly this one sentence, a president would appoint a justice every 2 years. Were they trying to sneak through a proposal that would allow for court packing? If Senator Vice President Harris gets to be president of the United States, she has 4 years. That would give her 2 additional appointments without regard to how many justices there are. At least that's the way I read it. Now, you may read it as saying 2 justices, a justice every 2 years if there's a vacancy, but that's not the way it reads. And so I think I got something. I think I found something. I think I caught them on something. I may be wrong, but I want to hear clarification. I want to see some letters to the editor of the Washington Post asking for a clarification of the president's view. Do you believe that a president should be allowed to appoint a justice every other year, regardless of how many justices are on the Supreme Court? That would be court packing through the back door. And I suspect there are some people on the president's commission on the Supreme Court who would favor that form of backdoor court packing. Now, it could backfire. What if Trump is elected and he gets then 2 years? Now, none of this is going to happen in reality because you need a constitutional amendment to change the current constitutional requirement that justices are appointed for good behavior, which means during their lifetime. Now, there's an argument for term limits. After all, when the framers of the Constitution wrote Article 3, the average lifespan of a justice was 50-something. So if they were appointed at 40, they had term limits, God-imposed term limits, or medically imposed term limits, not judicially or legislatively imposed term limits. But very few justices back in the day served 20 or 30 years. But in the 20th century and 21st century, that happened. Oliver Wendell Holmes served many, many years. Brandeis served many, many years. Douglas, Frankfurter, Black, the justice I clerked for, served 3 years, I think. And then he resigned to become ambassador to the United Nations. A foolish mistake I think he made, something I urged him not to do, but he followed his own decisions and decided to leave the Supreme Court. But now we have justices who are serving many years. My friend and former colleague Steve Breyer served, I think, 25 years or something like that, maybe even longer. and other justices has also served long terms. There is an argument for term limitations. There is no argument, however, for adding justices to the Supreme Court, because if the Democrats can make it, 11, the Republicans can make it 13, and we're going to get a Supreme Court that's the size of the Senate before long, packed with people and justices who will serve the interests of the president who appoints them. We don't want that. Look, the Supreme Court has turned right, it's turned left, it's turned centrist. When I was a law clerk on the Supreme Court, it was turning left. Chief Justice Earl Warren on the left, Brennan on the left, Goldberg on the left, Black on the left. It was a split court, had a lot of 5-4 decisions, but and there were a couple of real conservatives, but the court consisted mostly of people on the left and people in the center. And then it became even more left during a period of time. Now it's moved right. That's the nature of the Supreme Court, and it will change over time naturally. And the people who are on the opposite side of the political spectrum don't like it when it turns against them. The same thing happened in Israel, and the mirror image, the exact opposite. In Israel, the right was concerned that the Israeli Supreme Court had turned too far left, so they introduced structural reforms. Oh, nothing to do with the politics or ideology. It has to do with making the Supreme Court a better institution. Nonsense. It was all designed to turn the Supreme Court in Israel from left to right. And in the United States, it's designed to turn the Supreme Court from right to left. And both are wrong. The Supreme Court should operate with 9 justices, either with lifetime tenure or with neutrally applied term limits. I don't support age limits. I do perhaps for the presidency, but I don't for justices, because if you had age limits, then presidents would start appointing fetuses to the Supreme Court. Obviously, I don't mean that literally, but they would start appointing 30-year-olds to the Supreme Court in the hope that if there are age limits, say 75, a person appointed at 35 could serve 40 years. So you don't want age limits. What you want is term limits, so that way the justices are appointed without regard to age. And I think justices should be mature. Look, Oliver Wendell Holmes was 60 when he was appointed to the Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was 60. I think Justice Brandeis was 60. And they all served 20-something years because they lived long. And we have to anticipate that our justices today will live much longer lives than the justices of the past have lived. Look, the important thing is to recognize that the Supreme Court is today being weaponized by both sides. Both sides want the Supreme Court to do its bidding, and they want the Supreme Court to render decisions that satisfy their political and partisan goals, whether they be abortion decisions, immunity decisions, or gun decisions. The Supreme Court has become a place where ideology has become increasingly important. Look, nobody cared about the Supreme Court throughout most of our history. Obviously, the Dred Scott decision helped precipitate the Civil War, but for the most part, the Supreme Court rendered decisions that didn't affect the lives of ordinary people. But when it got into the business of regulating the bedroom, the deathbed, gay rights, abortion rights, gun rights, people care about who's on the Supreme Court. And that's why, although Justice Ginsburg was confirmed, I think 98-2 or something like that, and others have been confirmed by overwhelming majorities, it really all started with Bork and with my friend Ted Kennedy, who opposed the Bork nomination primarily on ideological grounds. I remember his speech when he was saying Bork would have us live in a world where women have to get their abortions in back alleys, etc. And so Bork got borked, and that became a verb. And then once Bork happened, there was a period of time after Bork when there was still Scalia got confirmed overwhelmingly. But now, in recent years, the confirmations have been very, very political. Kavanaugh, very, very partisan and political. Thomas, very partisan and very political. In both those cases, there were allegations of sexual misconduct, neither of which were proved to anybody's satisfaction. But there was enough to create a veneer of controversiality, which led to very, very closely divided votes. And now virtually all Supreme Court appointments are divided very, very closely on ideological grounds. And the Republicans are as much at fault, maybe even more in this case, than the Democrats. They denied Garland the opportunity even to have a hearing because they said that his nomination came too close to a presidential election. Was it 10 months or something like that? And then they appointed Barrett, who within a month or so of the presidential election. Hypocrisy, double standards. You can't justify that. The only reason that Republicans changed their view is not on principle, but because they could, because they had the votes to do it. And so we're seeing the Supreme Court and the entire legal system. We're supposed to have a legal system that's nonpartisan. The law that Biden wants to propose to change immunity is called the "No person is above the law." Yeah, it's a nice statement, no person is above the law, but we have congressional immunity, we have judicial immunity, we have all kinds of immunity throughout our system. Why not presidential immunity of some kind? Maybe the court went too far. In my view, the court did go too far in its evidentiary rulings about immunity, but that doesn't mean there can't be some presidential immunity. So what we're seeing is the complete politicization of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is being turned into an institution that is ideological and political and partisan. Bush versus Gore, 5-4, 5 Republicans voting to make Bush president over 4 Democrats who voted to essentially make Gore president. That hurt the Supreme Court greatly. I wrote a whole book on that called Supreme Injustice, in which I went after all the justices of the Supreme Court who voted in a partisan way, but particularly the Republicans who were overtly political in that case, and particularly my friend Antonin Scalia, who were very rarely granted stays, even in capital cases, and granted a stay in that case. So there's a lot of fault to go around on all sides. But as somebody who cares deeply about the Constitution, who cares deeply about the Constitution of the United States, I've written about it, I've taught about it, I've litigated about it. I want to see our justice system remain ideologically neutral, politically neutral in a partisan way. That was the framers' intention. Article 3 of the Constitution gives justices life tenure in order not to have them influenced by the political winds of the day. And it's never been 100% neutral. Obviously, the courts have always been influenced by politics, by what's going on outside. And you might say, well, maybe today there's a virtue. It's being done so overtly. It's being done so clearly and so publicly that nobody's fooled anymore. People used to get fooled by the Whigs, and other accoutrements of neutrality that were applied. Today, it's out in the open. I don't like it, though. I don't like the fact that courts are so partisan. I don't like the fact that a New York district attorney, elected district attorneys, by the way, we should never elect prosecutors. They should never be elected. They should be part of the civil service, appointed for 10-year terms to do justice, not to do political injustice. As I've said before, the New York case against Donald Trump, the single worst criminal case I've ever seen. Obviously, when you had people being prosecuted in the South during Jim Crow on racial grounds, that was even worse. But I'm talking about in kind of today's world, it's very hard to find a case worse than the making up of a crime against Donald Trump, or all the cases that have been directed against Donald Trump. If his name weren't Donald Trump and he weren't running for president, none of these cases would have been brought. None of them, not a single one of them. And yet, yes, the Supreme Court reacts, and we have a balance. We have um, very democratic left wing district court trial courts balanced by a more conservative Supreme Court with courts of appeals somehow in the middle. I don't like partisan justice on either side, and it's very important to try to fight against it in every possible way. We're losing that fight, however. We're losing that fight, and we have to regain control over our system of checks and balances. Um, when the judicial institutions, the legal institutions, the rule of law becomes part of the political process, I think we've lost our checks and balances, or at least we've diminished our checks and balances. So I hope for a day when the Supreme Court will have institutional changes. I'm happy to have institutional changes. I'm happy to see a constitutional amendment if the public favors it with term limits. I'm happy to have a constitutional amendment or maybe even legislation that imposes ethical rules, neutral ethical rules on the justices. Right now, these ethical rules are being targeted at two justices. Um, we've had ethical problems in the past. Abe Fortas had ethical problems, ultimately left the Supreme Court. Um, Bill Douglas had some ethical issues back in the day, but the attempt to get an ethics code now is directed essentially at Justices Thomas and Alito for what they've done. Believe me, if Alito and Thomas had voted, quote, the right way or the left way on the abortion cases, the gun cases, the immunity cases, I don't think we'd see as much concern about whether they took a trip on an airplane, went on a fishing jaunt, or whether somebody flew a flag outside their house. These ethics complaints are largely focused on justices whose political and ideological and judicial views are out of sync with the left. That doesn't mean that they don't have a basis for making some arguments about ethical lapses, and it doesn't mean that they're wrong in seeking some kind of ethical rules that govern the Supreme Court. They should. It's their motive for doing it. It's their timing. It's the fact that President Biden writes this op-ed in the middle of a political campaign. He starts the op-ed by focusing on the Supreme Court's decision on immunity. He calls it the statute above, no one's above the law statute. So clearly the motivation is to introduce the Supreme Court into the campaign and allow the Democratic candidate, in this case Harris, to run against the Supreme Court, to run against the abortion decision, the immunity decision, a range of other decisions, the gun decisions. And I don't think that's a proper basis for having reform. The structural reforms that are suggested have some merit independently. Let them be debated after the election, but let them not become part of the election campaign that we're now undergoing. This is one of the most heated, controversial, and close campaigns. Indeed, the campaign has shifted dramatically in the past 10 days. 10 days ago, it looked like Trump was going to win in a landslide over Biden. Now, with the introduction of Kamala Harris and the rollout, which was extraordinarily successful by the Democrats, this is much closer. This is unpredictable. Nobody can tell you who's going to win this election. I think we can all tell you who will win the popular vote, and Trump has never won a popular vote, and he's, I don't believe, going to win the popular vote here too. But the Electoral College is much more complicated, much more difficult, and much harder to predict. So we're in the midst of a very, very contentious campaign. And the last thing we need is to introduce the Supreme Court and the legal system as a campaign issue that divides Democrats from Republicans. So I object to the Biden op-ed in the New York Times and the Washington Post, rather. And I worry that somebody, I think I know who it is, somebody smuggled in that statement. President would appoint the justice every 2 years. Watch that statement. Watch that statement and see whether that statement was intended to surreptitiously bring us closer to court packing. It may have been, and I want to hear President Biden's explanation of why that sentence was put in. That phrase in the sentence itself is okay. Spend 18 years in active service in the Supreme Court, but the president would appoint the justice every 2 years. Pregnant statement, loaded statement, worrisome and dangerous statement. Burdens on you, President Biden. Explain it. Okay, let's see what we're doing on letters today. Oh, this is an interesting one. Just wait for the Democratic Convention in Chicago coming soon. The terrorist arm of the Democratic Party will be on full display, and all hell will be breaking loose. It's going to be a huge, and then a dirty word, show, and it's the normal people that are going to suffer from their violence. Look, I remember Chicago 1968. I was one of the lawyers for the Chicago 7, Chicago 8 on appeal. And so I remember what that convention did, and it destroyed the Democratic Party, and it handed the election over to Richard Nixon, who was then forced to leave office. So we'll see what effect the Democratic convention has on voting. I do think there will be protests, and if they're anything like the protests that occurred in Washington, D.C. when Prime Minister Netanyahu came to speak with signs desecrating important structures and sculptures in the United States, with Hamas is coming here, Hamas, burning American flags. We'll see. If they start burning American flags at the Democratic Convention, that will certainly not help the Democrats. Okay. Let's see where we are on some others. I just can't stand it any longer. Your opinion that both sides are destroying the Constitution is so clearly partisan that I am done with trying to consider you as fair. Well, you can consider me as fair or not. I'm going to always look at both sides of the issue. That's who I am. That's who I've always been, and that's who I will always be. I am not a partisan when it comes to the Constitution. There was another letter that relates to that I'll read as well. When Republicans embark on lawfare, then you can condemn them. But it's the Democrats who have been doing this, not both equally. Doesn't mean to blame everyone. How is that just? Well, no. Look at the attempt to impeach Mayorkas. That was lawfare. Mayorkas, you may be critical of what he did at the border, but he didn't commit treason or bribery or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And to say that he did is to invoke a lawfare. And so I think both sides are guilty of using the legal system for their own partisan purposes. People seem to forget that FDR named 9 straight justices to the Supreme Court without resorting to any packing schemes. Did Republicans respond by refusing to process liberal appointments? No. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was approved 96-3. It was Democrats who started this crap with Bork and Thomas, and it hasn't let up. Which party is it that doesn't respect our institutions? Both. Look what happened with Garland, not even getting a hearing. So I think both parties. Now, you might argue, and I think you were probably right, that the Democrats have engaged in worse lawfare than the Republicans have. But I'm going to take both sides. I'm going to always put the Constitution first and partisanship second. That's who I am. That's who I will be. And if you want to watch my show, understand that this is not a partisan show that always comes out in favor of one party or the other. It's a show that always comes out in favor of the Constitution. Okay. Packing the court is in question, not term limits. Thought you described the threshold and procedures for stacking the court with more justices. Maybe some history of why FDR couldn't do it. and the concessions he received for merely threatening to pack the court. Yeah, I've mentioned some of those. Roosevelt was well-intentioned. He wanted to see the New Deal upheld, but he used the wrong tactic, and he was rebuffed by his own party, and I think properly so. And so, condemnation, Democrats, Republicans, whoever deserves it, whoever tries to compromise the Constitution, they're going to get criticized by me, like it or not. That's who I am. I'll see you tomorrow.